Chapter 1, An Introduction to the Human Body. First of all, welcome everyone. This is Chapter 1 of the OpenStax textbook for your course Anatomy and Physiology 1 at Linear Tech. My name is Dr. Kevin Harrison, and I will be your instructor. So, I'm going to be doing some voiceovers of these PowerPoints so that you guys can watch them at your leisure. And if you have any questions, of course, you can contact me via email or during class time regarding what we go over in the PowerPoints for this course. So, anatomy. Well, what is it? Well, it's the study of form and structure. And in this case here, we're talking about form and structure of the human body. So, the term anatomy comes from Latin. As you go through this course, you'll find that when we're studying anatomy, a lot of the words that we use, or all the words we use, are Latin. And when we're studying physiology, most of the words that we're using there are Greek. Why is that? Well, that way everybody speaks the same language. Okay, so anatomy, Latin, dead language, it's not going to change that much. It doesn't matter where you go in the world. Okay, when you're talking about different anatomical structures, using that common language, everybody knows what we're talking about. So if I were to go over to France or Russia or to Japan, when discussing anatomy, we all use the same language. Okay, so anatomy means a cutting open, and it's the study of internal and external structures of the body and the physical relationships among those body parts. In the healthcare field, understanding the physical relationships among body parts is very important in going ahead and diagnosing what is wrong with your patient and trying to figure out how the best way to help them. For hundreds of years, the study of anatomy was more on the gross side for things that we could see with our eyes. And probably in the past 60, 70 years, there's really been an explosion in the microscopic anatomy and understanding the actual anatomy of cells, even within the cell itself, and different tissues of different organs of the body. So that's what we're embarking on in this PowerPoint and in this course. So I hope you all enjoy. So as I was saying for the previous PowerPoint, there is a subdivision of anatomy. There's the gross and the microscopic. So for example, gross anatomy, you're looking at more structures and systems, maybe some conglomerates of tissues within the body. And that's been going on for probably hundreds, thousands of years when studying anatomy. However, as technology has improved, we can now delve into more microscopic anatomy, where we can look at the exact same structure, though at a different scale. So on our left side here, we can go ahead and see, oh yeah, here's our brain right here. And when you look at it, just like, well, it's just a bunch of folds and bumps and all sorts of different things going on. But when you get a microscope out, you can actually see the individual cells that make up the brain. And even with more powerful microscopes, such as electron microscopes, you can actually see, with real strong ones, the actual molecules and how they move and interact with one another inside your brain. So we've gone just from on the left-hand side of just looking at the brain and kind of wondering, it's like, well, what happens in here? And now on the right in purple, we can actually start to see how different cells and different tissues interact with one another to make that organ work. Gross anatomy, it's not the study of things that are gross, it's the study of large structures and features usually visible with the unaided eye. Now, I am a healthcare professional. I am a chiropractor. I've been practicing for almost 20 years now. So I rely a lot on gross anatomy. And in your healthcare field, whether you're going into to be a dental hygienist, to be a nurse, occupational therapist assistant, physical therapy assistant, you're going to rely a lot on gross anatomy. Okay, being able to look at an individual and understand their anatomy will help with their management and helping them get better. So with gross anatomy, we can break it down to even more subsections. So there's surface anatomy, where we can go ahead and look at an individual and kind of use our x-ray vision and kind of peer through the skin and recognize different structures. Then there's regional anatomy, which is basically, okay, I'll look at the shoulder and I'll see all the different parts that run through it, the muscles, the bones, the nerves, the ligaments. Did I say blood vessels already? Blood vessels, all the different things that make up a shoulder. And then there's systemic anatomy, where we look at, okay, cardiovascular system, what is that anatomy? The respiratory system, the reproductive system. So those are the different parts of gross anatomy. So it's trying to surface anatomy, what all the different lumps and bumps on somebody's skin is, or what's underneath the skin, what they are. Regional anatomy, again, it's just kind of looking at a region of the body and looking at all the different anatomical parts, maybe from different systems that make up that region. And then the systemic anatomy is kind of looking at, well, for example, the nervous system, looking at the brain and the spine and spinal cord and all the nerves that make up the nervous system. Microscopic anatomy, these are structures that can't be seen without magnification, so we have to use special equipment. First of all, we started off with dissecting microscopes, so we can see different tissue structures. So we could have an organ, say like the pancreas, and it's made up of different tissues. It's what's known as an exocrine and an endocrine organ. So it secretes things to help with digestion, yet it also helps control blood sugar. So there's two different tissues that make up the pancreas. And before the microscope, we didn't notice the difference between the two. It was just pancreas. But now that we have a dissecting microscope, we can go ahead and see the different tissue structures. Now with the light microscope, we're able to go ahead and see the actual cells that make up that tissue. So that was another advancement in microscopic anatomy. And now that we have the electron microscope, we can see individual molecules that are only a few nanometers across. So we can actually look into the cell and see how they function within that small space. And the study of looking at the anatomy of cells is called cytology. And when we look at the anatomy of tissues, or basically how cells interact with one another, that's known as histology. Now, I spent a lot of time kind of going over what is anatomy. Now we can talk about physiology. And physiology is the study of function. How do those anatomical structures function together and interact with one another? So these functions are very complex and are more difficult to examine than most anatomical structures. I always tell students you can't have one without the other. You can't understand physiology without knowing anatomy, and you can't understand anatomy unless you know physiology, because they work together. Okay? If you've ever taken a history class, you know that history doesn't make sense until you know the geography of the area, and vice versa. It's the same thing with the human body. You need to know the anatomy, you need to know the physiology to understand how things function. So they always work hand in hand. When studying anatomy and physiology, we need to understand the cell theory, and there are three basic principles to deal with the cell theory. The first one is cells are the structural building blocks of all plants and animals. Second is that cells are produced by division of pre-existing cells. So we get all our cells from pre-existing cells, and that's through the act of mitosis. And cells are the smallest structural units that perform all vital functions. So main thing to take from this slide here is that they're the structural building blocks. They are produced from pre-existing cells, and they're our smallest structural units that can perform all vital functions. So structural building blocks from pre-existing cells, and they perform all our vital functions. One thing that'll help you starting off studying anatomy and physiology is to understand, or at least have a good idea of, the levels of organization. Some of these topics that we're going to cover over the next couple of weeks can get a little bit complex. But if you understand that you can kind of break them down to smaller pieces, it makes it a little bit easier to digest, right? Just like we do with food. You get a nice big steak, you can't stuff that whole thing in your mouth. You got to cut it up into smaller pieces and chew it up into even smaller pieces, and then you're able to digest it. So starting off with the levels of organization, we usually start off at a chemical level where we look at the atoms that make up the body. And really there's only about 4 different types of atoms that make up the body. We've got oxygen, we've got some nitrogen, we've got carbon, we've got hydrogen. Just those 4. Now there are some other ones in there, but the majority of them are those 4. Those atoms will interact with one another to form molecules. Those molecules will come together and form the organelles, which are the structures inside the cell and actually help form the cell itself. So we start off with atoms, we get to molecules, and then we get into cells. Cells come together to form tissues. Tissues come together to form organs. Organs come together to form organ systems, and then those organ systems come together to form the organism. So if you just remember that kind of progression from atoms all the way up to an organism, it makes understanding a lot of the material that we're going to cover much easier. Now, over the next couple of slide plates, we're going to talk about some of the major systems in the body. What you're responsible for is knowing some of the major organs in these systems and what each system does. So the first one we're going to start off with, I'll just do it in green, is the lymphatic system right here. So the lymphatic system, what it does is helps return fluid to the blood, and it helps defend against pathogens. So the lymphatic system kind of works together with the immune system, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And some of the major organs in the lymphatic system is the thymus, which is located right there. And we've got lymph nodes all over our body. Major organ is the spleen, which we find in the abdomen. And we have all sorts of lymphatic vessels that help drain that fluid back into the bloodstream, back into the cardiovascular system. So the lymphatic system works hand in hand with the cardiovascular system and the immune system. One thing to understand about all these systems that we're going to talk about is that they don't exist completely on their own. They interact with multiple systems and work together. The next one is the respiratory system. So it helps remove carbon dioxide from the body, which is a waste product due to metabolism, and it helps deliver oxygen to the blood, which can then be delivered to working tissues. So some of our major structures in the respiratory system is our nasal passage, and that takes in air, and the air then moves through the trachea, which is right here, to the lungs where respiration actually occurs. Here's our muscular system. This enables movement and helps maintain body temperature. And we'll see in a couple more slides how important this is, help maintaining body temperature. So there are 636 muscles in the body. We're going to go over some of them when we get to that chapter in the course, but I just want you to understand that the muscular system is made up of muscles and tendons. So we've got those 2 different structures there. And like I said, we'll go over those in great detail. You'll be hating me probably about the middle of the course. So our nervous system, this helps detect and process sensory information and activates body responses. I like to think of the nervous system here as kind of the control system. It just helps organize everything in the body. It does it really fast. Okay, we're going to see another system called the endocrine system that helps activate body responses and process some information, but it's a very slow moving system. The nervous system is very fast. So main structures you need to know, of course, are the brain and the spinal cord and the peripheral nerves. So this is where everything happens. This is the highway, the spinal cord that connects the brain to the entire body, the peripheral nerves. The integumentary system, that's just a fancy word for skin. Okay, so it helps enclose internal body structures, helps protect them, prevent infections, and it's site of many sensory receptors. So again, the integumentary system, it interacts with the immune system, it interacts with the lymphatic system, and also interacts with the nervous system. Again, these systems all work with one another. There's not one that just exists separately on its own. So the integumentary system. And major components of that is, of course, body hair, the skin, and the nails. Now the skeletal system, which I'll do in this lovely orange color right here. So this helps support the body and helps enable movement, and it's Also important because it helps store minerals. Most of you know that bones are made up of calcium, but also within bones is where red blood cells are produced, so it's part of the cardiovascular system. Again, these systems work together. So there's the actual bones themselves, right? And then cartilage is also part of that. And we'll spend a lot of time talking about different types of joints and different joints of the body which allow movement, okay? And of course, what causes the movement is the muscular system. So they all work together. So when I was talking about the nervous system, I kind of mentioned this one here, the endocrine system. So it's another system that helps control body function, but it works more slowly than the endocrine system because it secretes hormones, and these hormones are transmitted through the bloodstream. So it takes them a little bit more time to get where they need to go. So it regulates bodily processes such as maturity, metabolism, and so forth. So some major structures for the endocrine system is the pituitary gland at the base of the brain, the thyroid gland, which you can feel on the front part of your neck. If you go ahead and find your chin and kind of work down right above your collarbone on either side, that's your thyroid gland. It helps control metabolism. Pancreas helps with digestion, also helps with insulin. Adrenal glands help with the nervous system as well, fight or flight. You know, if you get scared, you get that big adrenaline rush that comes from the adrenal glands. And in this larger picture here, the testes in males and females, it'll be the ovaries, so these help with reproduction as well. Over on the right here is our cardiovascular system. So it delivers oxygen and nutrients to tissues and helps equalize temperature in the body. So where does it get the oxygen from? Pulmonary system. How do we generate or equalize body temperature or generate heat in the body? Musculoskeletal system, right? So those working muscles. So with the cardiovascular system, we're more concerned about the heart and the blood vessels as well. Digestive system helps process food for use by our body and helps remove waste from undigested food. So this is how we take in energy, take in building blocks so that we can grow and repair, and it gets to where it needs to go, that working tissue, where we need those building blocks, of course, by the cardiovascular system. Again, just trying to illustrate how these systems all interact with one another. So with the digestive system here, we've got our stomach, we've got our liver, the gallbladder, large intestine, which helps eliminate waste, and the small intestine right here, this is where we absorb all of our food. The urinary system helps control water balance in the body, and again helps remove waste from blood and excretes them, so it's very well connected to the cardiovascular system, and also, surprisingly or not, respiratory system as well. So here we have our kidneys and our urinary bladder, and the connection between the two, I know it's not listed here, but I'm going to write it in there, is also your ureters. Okay, that's how urine gets from the kidneys, where urine is produced, down to the urinary bladder, and then exits to the body. So our last system that we're going to talk about in this chapter is the reproductive systems. So these systems help produce the sex hormones and gametes, and they help deliver it to the opposite sex. In the male reproductive system, we have our testes and the epididymis, okay, right here. And the female reproductive system, again, produces sex hormones and gametes, but a little bit different from the male reproductive system in that it'll help support the embryo and fetus until birth and help produce milk for the infant. So the female reproductive system is responsible not only for growing the offspring, but also nourishing it as well. So we have our mammillary glands and the ovaries, which produce the egg, and then the uterus where the fetus grows, and then until delivery. So although we call them the same thing, reproductive system, and they are analogous of one another, you can see that definitely the female has a different and more longer prolonged involvement in reproduction than the male. So just as a reminder for these organ systems that we've covered, make sure that you can identify the major organs. You can identify the major organs, and that you can also identify the major functions. So out of the ones that we just covered, you should be able to identify the major organs and identify their functions as well. Have you ever wondered what makes a living thing a living thing? Well, these are the characteristics of living organisms. Anything that we consider to be alive has these characteristics that we're going to go over. So the first one is responsiveness, meaning that the organism can recognize change in its external environment and its internal environment. And that's important because for an organism to survive changes in its internal external environment, there has to be the next characteristic, adaptability. So responsiveness recognizes change. Adaptability is the organism's change in behavior, capabilities, or structure. So adaptability is changes in behavior, capabilities, or structure. And that's required for survival. So our environment, either externally or internally, it's always changing. So living organisms can recognize that change and then make changes to adapt to that situation. Growth and development. So it can have an increase in size and development, and it can help for specific organisms. Okay, so somebody who goes to the gym to lift a lot of weights, you can see that because they have an increase in muscle mass. So that's growth and development. Again, it's kind of related to the response and adaptability. So you go ahead and you apply either an external or internal stress, you see growth and development that occurs. So let me just use green here for growth and development. So it's an inherited pattern for growth and development, and this is usually dependent on their DNA. Okay, so I decide I want to go swim, I'm not going to grow fins because I don't have it in my DNA. Okay, that's what we're talking about, how important DNA is. Reproduction, the ability to produce the next generation. So with humans or sexual reproduction, depending on the animal, there could be asexual reproduction where they just kind of split off and then you have two daughter organisms. But one thing about sexual reproduction is that there can be variations that can occur. They can actually be beneficial to the organism. Locomotion and movement, or movement and locomotion. So this is an organism's ability to change orientation or position or to move around an environment. So for animals, that's important to go ahead and chase down maybe some prey, a food source. With plants, it's their ability to kind of track the sun, if you want to think of it that way. So it's the change orientation or position, okay, or move around. So those are some characteristics that all living organisms share. Now, these next characteristics of living organisms, they really depend on the size and the complexity of an organism. So, for example, a worm versus a frog versus a human, yes, they have respiration, but that mechanism behind it changes. Okay, so for a worm, they usually just take in oxygen through their skin. Frogs, they do have lungs, but they can also take in oxygen through their skin. Humans, we only take in oxygen through our lungs, for example. So that's what we're talking about, the size and complexity of the organism. So respiration, again, oxygen absorption, and removal of carbon dioxide. With circulation, movement of fluid within the organism. So like insects, they don't really have a heart. The fluid just kind of moves due to changes in pressure, usually from movement or maybe the beating of their wings. We're larger animals. We have hearts, so that's the pump that's involved, but usually it's a
pump and a network of special vessels for circulation. With digestion, the chemical breakdown of complex materials for absorption and use by the organism. So it's their, it's their ability to support growth or to generate energy. And then excretion is the elimination of chemical waste products generated by the organism. So again, all these, they do occur with living organisms, but how it actually occurs depends on the type of organism. For example, with excretion, okay, desert animals such as like cats have much more efficient kidneys than humans, but we usually think humans as being, more complex. Well, in that instance, it's like, no, our kidneys don't work as well as cats. Okay, so again, depending on the complexity of the organism, there can be different variations. So here we have a picture of marathon runners, and this is just to help illustrate some of the characteristics of living organisms, responsiveness and movement. So here are some individuals that decided to be foolish and to run 26 miles. I don't know why they would want to do that. So they go ahead and they start running. That's the movement. And as they are running, those muscles are contracting, generating heat. The body responds to that increase in body temperature, and they start to sweat to lower that body temperature down. So that's responsiveness and the adaptability. So that's just an example of the characteristics of living organisms. Now, a lot of the systems that we've talked about have to deal with taking energy in, or taking food products in, converting it into energy, and then distributing it to different parts of the body, either for movement or for growth. Now, all the different reactions that occur in the body can be kind of bunched in together and called metabolism. And there's really two different parts of metabolism. There's catabolism. Okay, catabolism right here. This is when you break things down. You break things down. Anabolism is when you build things up. And an easy way to remember this, and I remember it because I was involved in sports when I was younger, and I was involved in sports in like the 80s and 90s and 2000s when people were taking steroids. So nobody ever took a catabolic steroid because that would just break things down. They took anabolic steroids. So bodybuilders take anabolic steroids. Anabolism is building things up. Catabolism breaks things down. Hopefully that's an easy way to remember it. So when you break things down, like with catabolism, you release energy. So when we take in food, we break it down. That's catabolism. We take the energy that's in the food and we break it down, and then we can use that to help build up our own bodies, the anabolism, whether we're building muscle tissue, nervous tissue, bone tissue, and so forth. So hopefully that's an easy way for you guys to remember the difference between the two. It can get a little bit confusing. So requirements for human life. These are things that every single person on the planet requires. Okay? We need oxygen. That's the first thing we need. Then we need nutrients. It's coming from our food. That's fats, proteins, carbohydrates, vitamins, minerals, all the building blocks that make up our body. We also need a narrow range of temperatures, and that's more internal, right? We need to keep our bodies within a narrow range of temperature, or else we get sick, whether it's too high or too low. And then the other requirement is atmospheric pressure. This is kind of related back to oxygen. So we can look at oxygen concentrations, but then we rely on atmospheric pressure to get oxygen into our body. It is a passive movement. Okay? In ANP2, if you've not taken it already, there is a chapter on respiration, and we go into great detail on how atmospheric pressures alter how much oxygen that can be delivered to the body. That's why people who go up to high altitudes have problems breathing. It's not because they don't have enough oxygen, it's that they don't have the pressure pushing it across the lung parenchyma into the bloodstream. So that's why atmospheric pressure is here. But again, it's kind of related to the delivery of oxygen. So those are the 4 requirements for human life. So humans can exist in harsh conditions, but there has to be some adaptability that goes along with it. So probably one of the most harshest environments on planet Earth is the Himalayas, climbing Mount Everest. So it's extremely cold, it has low oxygen levels and a low barometric pressure. So it's very hostile to human life. Now that doesn't mean that people don't live there, but people have adapted to it, or at least the species has adapted to it. So the extreme cold probably have a subcutaneous layer of fat, or they have a higher metabolic rate to generate more body temperature to adapt to it. Due to low oxygen levels, they probably have more hemoglobin in their blood, which carries oxygen. And dealing with low barometric pressure, they probably have a greater lung capacity, so their lung volume is greater as well. Now, these are adaptations that occur. Okay, we kind of see it in all sorts of different environments, right? It's you go to a very warm environment, like down here in the Atlanta area. Once the summertime comes around and people are out in the sun, they usually start producing a little bit more melanin in their skin. So they get a little bit darker. We call it a suntan, but that's kind of an example of adapting to a harsher condition. Okay, I grew up in Canada. If we ever meet, I'm pretty, like Chalk goes, wow, you're really white. So living down here, I've kind of developed what I guess would be a tan. I don't know how applicable that is. I've only lived down here for about 22 years now. I don't really have a tan, but there is some adaptability that goes on with it. So another harsh environment, or another thing that can happen in the environment that can affect humans, is temperature, so the external temperature. And we kind of touched upon it when I was discussing the marathon runners. So we can adapt to some degree to repeat exposure of high temperatures. So we can lose that subcutaneous layer of fat. We have sweat glands that can produce sweat and help evaporate. We can change body composition somewhat. We can lose body hair, different adaptations that way. But the main thing to take from this is that humans have the ability to adapt somewhat to their environment. Okay? So, and these are small adaptations, and they can occur in an individual. And a lot of times, when they talk about adaptations, like with for example, the Sherpas in the Himalayas, that's more of a species adaptation, where, an individual that could adapt to it better than another one, that other one died off, and the one that was able to survive in that environment was able to have progeny, have children, and they were able to be successful in there. So we're following along more with the Darwin's law of natural selection with that, but everybody has some adaptability to their environment. It just depends on how much and is it beneficial for them, so that they can go ahead and reproduce and have successful lives. Now this word here, homeostasis, this is very important in the study of anatomy and physiology. So it means that there's the presence of a stable internal environment. Remember, that is one of our requirements for human life, is that they have to have a stable internal environment. So failure to maintain homeostasis soon leads to illness or even death. Anytime somebody becomes ill or has some disease process, it is due to homeostasis being out of whack, meaning that they have an unstable internal environment. So homeostatic regulation is the adjustment of physiological systems to preserve homeostasis in an environment that are often inconsistent, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous. And maintaining homeostasis requires 3 things. It requires a receptor, a control center, and an effector. So receptor, that's usually sensory, some sort of sensor. Control center, it's either the nervous system or the endocrine system, and an effector, or a target tissue or target effector, that's either muscle or some sort of gland. So for me to explain to you the way that homeostasis works is you just need to think about your air conditioner, your AC unit, okay? So for homeostasis regulation, or with your air conditioning unit, right? Air conditioners are there in our homes to keep us nice and cool during the hot summer months here in Atlanta. So the way air conditioner works is that we have a thermostat. Well, that's our sensor, that's our receptor. So the stimulus is going to be an increase in the air temperature inside your house, right? Most people like to keep their house at like 72 degrees. I like to keep it a little bit cooler, right? Because I got kids running around doing all sorts of different things. So when the temperature goes above 72 degrees, that's the stimulus. And the sensor picks that up. It's always monitoring the air. And it goes ahead and it reads, it's like, uh-oh, it's 73 degrees. That sends a signal to the little computer chip inside the thermostat. And it says, hey, the temperature is getting a little too hot in here. We need to turn on and blow some cold air. That sends a signal up to the air conditioning unit that says, hey, you need to turn on. It goes ahead and turns on. It starts blowing cold air. Now, what that does is that it lowers the temperature. And once that temperature drops below 72 degrees, the sensor says, hey, this is too cold. We need to turn off the air conditioning unit. So it goes ahead and turns off the air conditioning unit. Everything's nice and cool. The temperature will gradually increase and get over 72 degrees. The sensor will say, oh, hey, it's getting over 72 degrees. I need to turn the air conditioning on. And that will just keep happening throughout the entire day. Okay? That is known as a negative feedback loop. A negative feedback loop, because it's being turned on and off, on and off. Okay? So that's how an air conditioner works. In our bodies, in the internal environment, body temperature usually wants to be about 37 degrees Celsius or 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. If it gets too hot, due to running a marathon, there are receptors that we have in our body, in our skin and in our muscles and throughout a different bloodstream that goes ahead and says, hey, temperature is getting too hot. It sends a signal up to the brain saying, hey, it's getting too hot. We need to cool down. The brain sends a signal to your skin to produce sweat. Sweat's produced along your skin. It evaporates. It cools you off. Those same receptors go, okay, we're nice and cool. We don't need to sweat as much anymore. And it sends a signal up to the brain saying, hey, you need to turn it off. And we turn off our sweat. And that just keeps going, on and off, on and off. That is a negative feedback loop. So one thing to understand is that homeostasis is not precise. It is a range. It is a range, as you can see right here. Okay? So it varies. With body temperature, we're kind of looking at between 36 to 38 degrees Celsius, or between 96 and 99 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's always changing, but it stays within that narrow range. That is the optimal range, just like our air conditioner, right? The temperature will kind of go up and down or oscillate around the set point. Same thing in our body. It's when we get outside of that normal range where we get into pathological conditions or diseases or illness. So we want to go ahead and stay at that set point. And the unique thing is that everybody has a set point, but it can be a little bit different. Okay? So my normal body temperature may be different than yours, but at least we're staying in that optimal range for that. So just remember, homeostasis is not a set point, but it's a range around that set point. Well, now that we've studied the negative feedback, there is what's known as a positive feedback. So positive feedback helps accelerate a process to completion. So it's not being turned on and off, it's being turned on and basically the volume being turned up every single time. So a good example of that is childbirth. So the stimulus is going to be the head of the baby pushes against the cervix. That sends a signal to the brain. So nerve impulses from the cervix are transmitted to the brain. The brain goes ahead and says, oh, the baby's coming. So it releases from the pituitary gland oxytocin. This oxytocin is carried in the bloodstream to the uterus. And the oxytocin stimulates uterine contractions and pushes the baby's head towards the cervix. Well, this irritates or stimulates the cervix even more, sending more nerve impulses to the brain to release more oxytocin, and then it's carried to the bloodstream to cause more contractions. And it just keeps going and going and going until there is no more pressure on the cervix. Right here, and that there shuts down the system. But until this is removed, this will keep occurring again and again and again until the baby's delivered. So that's an example of a positive feedback loop. Okay. Another good example is you've got young children, especially if they're like, toddler age, and they want a parent's attention. They usually start off with like, daddy, 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 and then they get louder and louder and louder. They may go, dad, 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 and then you'll turn to them and you'll go, what? And that'll stop the positive feedback loop because now they have your attention. So if you've got toddlers, you can understand that. If you've ever been pregnant and delivered a baby before, that's a positive feedback loop. Those are the only example I've got. So one thing that I stated at the beginning of this PowerPoint presentation is that we use a common language throughout the entire world when talking about anatomy and physiology. So usually with anatomy, it's Latin, and in physiology, it's Greek. That way you can go anywhere in the world and talk to somebody about anatomy and physiology, and you're all speaking the same language. So that's what we're going to talk about over the next couple of plates is anatomical terms. Again, it's that special language that we've learned, Latin, Greek origins. Sometimes things are named after who discovered it. For example, here, Broca's area. It was named after Dr. Broca. Eustachian tube, Krebs cycle are usually named after. We're starting to get away from that. We're starting to go with more generic terms. So like the Achilles tendon is now known as the calcaneal tendon, sorry, I'm stuttering a little bit, because it's a tendon that runs to the calcaneus. The Broca's area is now known as the speech center, the auditory tube, citric acid cycle. So we're kind of getting away from formal or discoverers' names and just going with more equivalent terms. It just makes it a little bit easier for everybody to understand. So here is a list of word roots, prefixes, and suffixes. Just to help you understand a lot of things that we're talking about in anatomy. So if you see a at the beginning of a word, that means without, such as avascular. Air means air, so aerobic metabolism. Algia means pain. Arter and arthro. Okay, arter is artery. Arthro means joint. Auto means automatic. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but make sure that you read through this list and understand it, because it will help you understand different physiologic and anatomical terms if you can understand the word roots, the prefixes, and suffixes. So make sure that you understand where these words are coming from and what they mean. So in addition to knowing the word roots, prefixes, and suffixes, you need to know the different regions of the human body. So when we talk about the human body and the different regions, we have, first of all, have to talk about anatomical position. Okay, so anatomical position. So this anterior view right here, which I'm just going to kind of mark it with yellow, this is anatomical position. It's individual standing facing forward, and their palms are facing forward as well. That way, this is a starting point. Again, just like we use Latin and Greek for anatomy and physiology, we use the anatomical positions that we all know where we're talking. So that is the starting point for it. So again, here's a list of all sorts of different regions in the body. Not going to go over them in this PowerPoint because I'll just bore you to death, but you do need to know all these different regions, right, and how they relate to it. So with this voiceover PowerPoint, the normal PowerPoint will be available on Blackboard. So you can kind of either pause this and read through the list or go to that PowerPoint and view it. So, but you need to understand all the different regions on the anterior and the posterior view. So previous slide dealt with the regions of the bodies. This one here, we're going to talk about directional terms. So again, when we're talking about the body, we need to have established kind of a base point where everybody can understand what we're talking about. So again, from anatomical position, where we have this right over here. Okay, so we can divide it, of course, the body into left and right. When we're talking about proximal and distal, proximal means it is closer to the trunk. So right here, proximal, it's closer to the trunk. So here's the body trunk right here. Distal means it's farther away. So in this image here, here's the individual's shoulder, their elbow, and their hand. So it's relative to different reference points. So the elbow here is distal to the shoulder, but it's proximal to the hand. The knee is distal to the hip, but proximal to the foot. Another term that we use is lateral and medial. Here is the midline. That is medial. As we move away from it, things become more lateral. On this side view, we have anterior, which is the front, also known as ventral. It's here. The posterior or the dorsal. So we've got front and back. And then we have up and down, cranial, meaning head, and caudal, meaning tail. Okay. One of the big jokes that I have is students or somebody that doesn't understand something, I say they have cranial caudal inversion, which is the polite way of just saying they have their head up their ass. But you can use that term. I won't copyright it at all. Okay. Another term which I kind of missed over on the far right is superior and inferior. So superior meaning towards the top of the head, inferior meaning down towards the bottom of the feet. A little bit different than cranial caudal. Okay, a little bit different because cranial caudal, that comes from more animal biology, right? Because if this was a quadruped, the caudal portion would be the most posterior, but because we're biped, it still works for us, but we're just talking about head and tail. If we're talking about superior, we're talking more, let me just kind of illustrate that out. Superior would be the top of the head, inferior would be the bottom of the feet. Okay, and again, that's a relative term because we can go ahead and say, well, the nose is superior to the umbilical, but the umbilical is superior to the knee, and the knee is inferior to the the hip and so forth. So a lot of it is relative to one another. So along with different directions of the body, we can divide the body into sectional planes. And we can divide them into 3 different planes. First one, which is the sagittal, which I'll talk about here, just basically divides the body into left and right, which I'll do in green right here. I always kind of associate these different planes with movement. So sagittal plane would be kind of doing like a front roll or a somersault. That's done in the sagittal plane. Okay. Our frontal or coronal plane, here in purple, okay, that would be like doing a cartwheel. So it divides the body into anterior or ventral and posterior dorsal. The transverse plane, which I will do in red right here, divides the body into superior and inferior. So if you were to do a pirouette or kind of spin on your toes, that would be done in the transverse plane. Okay. So again, sagittal, it's kind of like doing a somersault. Frontal is doing a cartwheel, and transverse is doing a pirouette. That's an easy way to remember all the different sectional planes of the body. Another way that we can kind of divide up our body is via cavities. Okay, we have two major body cavities. We have a dorsal body cavity and a ventral body cavity, or an anterior and posterior body cavity. So why do we have body cavities? Well, they're there to help protect organs from shocks and impacts, because we don't want our organs to get jostled around. And they allow for changes in size and shape of organs. So on our posterior, which I'll illustrate in orange, we have our cranial cavity, which contains our brain, and our vertebral cavity, which contains our spinal cord. So that's the only thing in the dorsal or posterior body cavity: cranial cavity, vertebral cavity. On the anterior, many more cavities. Okay? So we have our thoracic cavity, which contains the heart and lungs. We have our abdominal cavity, which contains our abdominal organs, digestive organs, and then we have our pelvic cavity right here, and that contains our urinary organs, bladder, part of the ureters, and reproductive organs, and part of our digestive organs too. The thoracic cavity can actually be kind of broken up into even more cavities, where we have superior mediastinal. I'm just going to do that in purple. That's right there. We have our pleural cavity, where we find our lungs, and we have a pericardial cavity. That's where we find our heart. Okay, so here's the pericardial. These are the pleural for the lungs, and there's the mediastinum, where we usually find our thymus as well. So just remember that our dorsal cavity, there are two. The ventral body cavities, there's three, and the thoracic cavity can be broken up into another three: superior, pleural, and pericardial. This plate right here is just another example of how to divide up the posterior or dorsal body cavities, anterior, ventral body cavities. So now we're going to get into some regions of the human body. Usually they're named after different structures, or the most prominent structure within that region. So for the head region, that's known as the cephalon, right? So that's known as the cephalic region. The cervicus, or the neck, is known as the cervical region. The thorax is the thoracic region. Brachium, that's the arm. Now, the arm anatomically is from your shoulder down to your elbow. That is your arm. That is your brachial region. From your elbow down to your wrist, that is your antebrachium. Okay, so again, from your shoulder to your elbow, that is your brachial region, and from your elbow down to your wrist, that is your antebrachial region. So your arm is from your shoulder to your elbow, your forearm is from your elbow down to your wrist. The wrist region is known as the carpal region. Your hand is known as the manual region. Of course, the abdomen is your abdominal region. Your low back is known as your lumbar region. Your buttocks is known as your gluteal region. Pelvis is the pelvic region. The anterior pelvis is known as the pubic region. The groin area is the inguinal region. Your thigh, that's from your hip down to your knee, that's the femoral region. From your knee down to your ankle, okay, at least on the anterior aspect, that's known as your crural region. On the back, it's known as your sural region. So crural is on the front, sural is on the back. Your ankle is known as the tarsal region. Your foot is known as your pedal region, and the sole of your foot is known as the plantar region. Now, the abdominal and pelvic region, there's a lot of organs in there. So we've actually gone and kind of divided it up. So we can divide it up into 4 quadrants, or we can divide it up into 9 regions. And it's important to know these quadrants and regions and what organ resides in them when you're dealing with someone who has an abdominal complaint. Because if they're complaining of, oh, I have pain in this region, if you know your anatomy, you can say, oh, well, I know that this organ or these organs are in that region. That's probably what's wrong with them. So we're going to go ahead and cover the abdominal pelvic quadrant and the different regions and the organs that are found in each one. So over here on the left here, okay? So these are the abdominal pelvic regions. Now there are 9 of them. There are 9 of them. Okay, we're going to start with the most superior. We have the right hypochondriac region. Now, hypochondriac means below the cartilage. Okay, so it's below the cartilaginous portion of the ribs. So it's the right hypochondriac region, and we find part of the liver there, a little bit of gallbladder. If we move more medial, we have the epigastric region. So it's just above the umbilicus or just above the stomach, epigastric. And then, of course, we have a right hypochondriac region. We have a left hypochondriac region right here. And then we have our epigastric. So those are the most superior regions in the abdomen. Just below that or inferior to that, we have a right lumbar region, an umbilical region, and a left lumbar region. Inferior to those, we have do that in blue, a right iliac region, a hypogastric region, meaning it's below the stomach or below the umbilicus, and then a left iliac region right here. So those are the 9 regions of the lumbopelvic. On the right here, we have quadrants. So basically, we've just divided it into 4 squares. So our right upper quadrant, let me do that in green right here. And we have a left upper quadrant. We have a right lower quadrant and a left lower quadrant. Okay. So again, if a patient in the future comes in and says, oh, I have pain right here, circle P with a circle around it usually says pain. If it's in the right upper quadrant, you should know that, okay, what is there? Well, we've got the liver, we've got gallbladder, we've got maybe a little bit of the large intestine going across there. So if they have pain there, it's probably something to do with the liver. If they say, well, I have pain in the left upper quadrant, well, we've got just a sliver of liver up there, not too much, but it's the stomach. So maybe we're thinking ulcers or maybe gastritis associated with it. So that's why it's important to understand the different regions, the different quadrants, so that when a patient comes in with pain in those regions or quadrants, you know what's in them and you can help diagnose what's wrong with them. So it is important to know the regions, the quadrants, but also what's in each region and what's in each quadrant. Now, as I was saying earlier, we have these different cavities to help protect our organs. Organs have another layer of protection known as the serous membrane. And these usually cover a lot of our vital organs, such as our heart, our lungs, and our intestines. So the way to think about it is like someone over here on the right kind of pushing their hand into a balloon. So you can see that when they do that, we've got an outer layer of the balloon here, and we have an inner layer right up against their hand. Now, with anatomical structures, that outer layer in purple is known as the parietal layer. The parietal layer right here. That usually lines the cavity wall. The green layer is known as the visceral layer because it lies right up against that organ. In this case here, it's the heart. Now, with the balloon, we have an air space, but in the body, it's not filled with air. It's filled with a very thin fluid known as serous fluid. And that's what resides in the cavity. So I'm just going to kind of fill that in with yellow here. I just like to think of it as yellow. That's known as serous fluid. Okay, and that helps protect and helps give the organs space to move. So with the heart's always beating, it's always moving. This cuts down on the friction and allows it to contract and pump blood with more efficiency. So we're kind of going to wrap up this PowerPoint presentation just talking about different forms of medical imaging. Probably the most well-known is the X-ray machine, where we bombard part of the human body with X-rays. They pass through and they hit film, and they develop an image that way. So it's been around since late 1800s, early 20th century. From the X-ray machine, we have computed tomography, also known as a CT scan or a CAT scan, still using X-ray. But instead of the beam just being shot in one direction, it moves around so we get a better idea and we can see different dimensions within that patient. Magnetic resonance imaging, or an MRI, it's a really big magnet. It basically tracks the spin of hydrogen atoms in a molecule, and that's how it produces an image. So it's very good at looking at soft tissue, while X-ray and CT is more for hard tissue or a little bit more dense tissue. Positronic emission tomography, that's where you can go ahead and put in a radioactive substance in the bloodstream, and you measure the in a way you're measuring the radiation that's given off, and you can map that. So it's looking at basically areas of metabolism. So you would kind of use that to see, areas of high metabolic rate. So it could be used to help diagnose, insidious fractures or cancerous growth. Or PET scans are used for brain activity as well. So again, it kind of tracks metabolic activity. And then finally, ultrasonography or an ultrasound. Here we use acoustic sound waves. They'll go ahead and bounce back to from the transducer back to the receptor, and then you can get an idea of what an object looks like very quickly. So X-ray machines, they're really good for bones and so forth. CT, good as well. MRI is probably the best, but it takes forever to do. Okay, if you ever had an MRI done, sometimes they can take up to like 3 hours, and you got to get into this really small tube, and they're really, really expensive. Positronic emission tomography, again, takes a really long time to do. Ultrasound, not that great of a picture, but man, you can do it fast. Okay, like 30 seconds and bang, you're done. So each one of them has their purpose. And again, kind of just depending on what you're trying to diagnose is what you'll go ahead and choose to use for your imaging. So this is a really excellent radiograph of a person's hand. You can go ahead and see all the different structures. You can see the distal end of the radius and the ulna, all the carpals, all the metacarpals, and all the phalanges, and see if there's any disruption within the cortex of the bone. So again, they're used very well for looking at bones, looking at fractures. Not really that good at looking at soft tissue, because you can see I can't really see the muscles associated with it. I can just see the more denser tissue here. So again, depending on what you want to see, that's when you'll use the different types of medical imaging. Okay, and just to conclude, up here, this is a CT scan. Again, they're kind of using X-rays, but incorporating it with a computer. So it's good to, it's not as good as an MRI to see soft tissue, but it can be done really quick. So personal story, and you'll get used to me saying that quite a bit because I have a lot of personal stories. So my son had to be taken in for a CT scan because he was riding his bike without a helmet. He was 4 years old, and got into a fight with the drain ditch, and the drain ditch won. So they were trying to rule out an intracranial bleed. They did a CT scan because they could get it done within 5 minutes. Should they have done an MRI? Of course they should have, but an MRI takes hours. You're dealing with a 4-year-old. The CT scan, to take the picture took a minute, and then for them to get it up on the computer screen took another 4 minutes, and they were done. So it works very quickly, but you don't get as great an image as you would with an MRI machine. So our MRI machine over here, really big, really expensive. Can't use it if you've got any metal in your body, such as dental work or metal implants and so forth, but is the gold standard for looking at soft tissue. Down here, we've got our PET scan, positronic emission test. Okay. So you give them, a fancy term is radiopharmaceuticals. So basically you're giving them something radioactive, and you're measuring how much radiation is emitted by that body part. And again, you can kind of see these white spots right here. Those are accumulations of the radiopharmaceuticals. So you can go ahead and look at areas of high metabolic rate. So it's very useful for diagnosing, again, cancerous growths, fractures that are healing, and brain activity. And then finally, we have our ultrasound tech right over here. Again, you know, some people are looking at that going, all I see is a blob, you know, and that's true. Okay, here we're actually looking at, this is ultrasound for pregnancy, so you can kind of see the fetus right there. Again, it's not very invasive, it's very quick to use, inexpensive, and you know, it easily portable too. All these other ones here, like I don't have a portable X-ray machine, I definitely don't have a portable MRI machine, but portable ultrasounds, yes, they're readily available. So again, depending on what you're trying to look at, that's the type of medical imaging. And the one unique thing that I forgot to mention about the ultrasound, no electromagnetic radiation. Okay, so it's safe to use basically on everyone. All right, so that concludes Chapter 1 PowerPoint. Again, this voiceover is available to you, as well as the PowerPoint posted up on Blackboard. So if you do have any questions, you can email the instructor, which is me, and I hope you enjoyed it.